he will eventually die. And when he does die, the various factions of the oligarchy will be battling with each other over who will take the throne. So, if you want to be strategically wise, it actually makes sense to get rid of Putin yourself, to end his regime, and to install your own people. There are others who are looking at this as a window of opportunity. This is the moment to strike. There's less soldiers than ever in Moscow. There's less ability to defend Putin, and you probably find more people willing to go against Putin now than ever. The people within Russia are not united behind Putin. He's really not interested in whether or not Russia can win the war, I think, as much as he's interested in making sure that he survives the war because he's scared of his own population. Russia is much more of a basket case than what we give it credit for. Russia knows very well if the US were to decide it wants to come to town, it could really turn things upside down very quickly for the Kremlin. The military currently is being humiliated by Putin. Putin took them off of the Kursk counteroffensive, and the answer is simple. They themselves are not sure how much longer Putin is going to be around for. The Putin regime is sort of typical for dictatorship. It has all the trappings of being powerful and able to project power, but behind that, it's actually quite brittle. If just enough pressure is put on it, it will crack, it will fall, it will break.
But first, I have a quick request for you guys. Sometimes our videos get downvoted heavily by Russian bots who just want to kill the reach of any video that criticizes Russia and Putin. So if you can just take a second to hit the like button below and share the video on your social media, that helps us out tremendously in the algorithm. Now, let's start. Today we have Jason J. Smart, who's joining us straight from Ukraine. He's a special correspondent at the Kiev Post and has been covering Russia for more than a decade.
Really great to see you.
So first, I just want to talk about the recent video that you published on your channel, where you talk about the fall of Putin, and you bring up some interesting points that I have not heard before. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
The Putin regime is sort of typical for dictatorship. It has all the trappings of being powerful and able to project power, but behind that, it's actually quite brittle. If just enough pressure is put on it, it will crack, it will fall, it will break. And then what we see in Russia is actually three different pressure points. So one of those pressure points, and I think the most important pressure point, frankly, is the economy. Russia's economy is a disaster. Their key interest rate at the central bank just a year ago was 8%. Today it's 19%. There's a lot of projections that they have to move the interest rate perhaps more than 25%. Business lending totally dries up. Now to get a mortgage, many banks require 50% interest or 30% interest for housing loans. It's just simply becoming unaffordable. But what's important about that? The Russian population is incredibly indebted with credit, loans, and other bank systems. And what happens with that is that now, as the interest rates are going to go up and the amount that people have to pay back monthly to the bank goes up, it's going to be very hard for them to do so. And we think a lot of people are going to walk away from their homes or from their investment properties. And why that's significant is the fact that if just a small number of them were to walk away and those loans turn bad, there's significant evidence that the banks of Russia would not be able to cope. And the Russian economy itself would not be able to cope. Because at this point, the housing bubble that was created by giving away free money to go buy properties will bust. And that could create significant problems. Real inflation in Russia is probably north of 24%. There's a lot of estimates who put it somewhere in the 30s. And Putin, everything that he's doing right now will only worsen it by printing money for domestic programs in Russia, including the war effort. So the other two areas that I think are really important here is the political angle as well as the military angle. So when I say the political angle, that means what's occurring domestically within the Kremlin. I have no illusion that the Russian people will rise up and come to the Kremlin and demand democracy. But I do think that there's people around Putin, namely the oligarchical class, who are looking out for their own self-interest. They recognize that Putin is already 72 next month. He will eventually die. And when he does die, the various factions of the oligarchy will be battling with each other over who will take the throne. And due to that, if you're an oligarch and you're on the out faction, you realize that you're unlikely to be able to come to power in such a circumstance. You realize that once your enemies come to power, they're going to liquidate you and they're going to liquidate your family and they're going to take all your assets. So if you want to be strategically wise, it actually makes sense to get rid of Putin yourself, to end his regime and to install your own people. But the only way that could happen, realistically, is if there's collusion with either the military or the intelligence services, preferably with both. But in the case of Russia, we know that there's a chance and a historic precedent that the Russian military just collapses, where soldiers stop fighting or soldiers run away. Something that could happen, especially if the economy were to become disastrous or hyperinflation were to kick in. So soldiers aren't receiving their salary or are unable to survive on it any longer. But the other side is that these people, these oligarchs, know that they have to align with somebody in the military intelligence service. And the military might be actually a great place to start. The military currently is being humiliated by Putin. Putin took them off of the Kursk counteroffensive, which is the oblast in Russia being occupied by Ukraine. He put the FSB, the perpetual enemy of the military, in charge of the operation. It's really an insult. But second to that, Putin did something even worse. He is now allowing the FSB to round up and arrest very senior officers in the Russian military for corruption. The fact is, everybody in the Russian military that's at a senior level, like the intelligence services, is engaged in corruption. So now it's being selectively enforced, as one would expect. But once again, if you're a general and you realize that eventually they're going to catch up with you as well and be asking about the questionable acquisitions you've made, you now have sort of a motive to operate in your own interest and against Putin and against the intelligence service. So if you're in league with others to do so, you could actually try to overthrow the government. And it's not as really radical as many people might think. And the simple example is when Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, went into Russia last year. And what we saw there was a dramatic breakdown of Russia's security services. We saw that the border guards didn't do anything to stop Prigozhin. The Chechen troops who Putin ordered to go protect Russia from the Prigozhin's people failed to do so. We saw that the National Guard failed to do anything. And the military itself, when Prigozhin got to Rostov, which is where the southern command of the Russian military is located, the generals came out and drank coffee with him. They were chatting with him in the street. They knew very well he was coming. They could have ordered an airstrike 20 kilometers before he got to the city, but they chose not to. They chose instead to drink coffee with him and try to persuade him. And the reason for that is simple. Why didn't they just kill him if they had the chance? Or at least arrest him? And the answer is simple. They themselves are not sure how much longer Putin is going to be around for. And they could not be really certain. Maybe Prigozhin will succeed. Maybe he's going to overthrow the power. And if he does, what will become of us who tried to prevent him? So it's better just to stand to the side and do very little. But if we go back to the political sense again, the most senior people in the Russian government during the entire Prigozhin saga did not speak out. They were silent. They themselves also had doubts what would come next. So I think looking ahead, Russia is much more of a basket case than what we give it credit for.
That makes sense. Quickly on that, you do talk about the economy at the beginning. And recently, the head of Ukraine's main intelligence services said that Russia's economic problem and the military problem will definitely catch up to it by 2025 or at the latest 2026. So that means Putin will be forced to end the war. Like, what are you thinking? Why did they say that so publicly?
Well, I think that within Russia itself, Putin is facing increasing pressure. One, the war is simply too expensive. Russia cannot afford it. But another factor here is that by wasting the country's potential and its resources, there are others who are looking at this as a window of opportunity. This is the moment to strike. There's less soldiers than ever in Moscow. There's less ability to defend Putin, and they probably find more people willing to go against Putin now than ever. Not because they support Ukraine by any means, but simply they realize in their own self-interest to benefit themselves, it might be very opportunistic to get rid of Putin while the population is already opposing him or opposing a lot of his decisions. And they're not, once again, going to go to protest, but they're also, most importantly, not going to block anybody who tries to get rid of him. Once again, when Prigozhin was in Rostov, Russia, we saw that the people came out, were bringing food to him, brought wine to him, brought water to his troops. They were very happy to see him. Myself, I was in Kursk, Russia last month, where Ukraine is occupying the territory. And having spoken to the locals there, it was quite clear that their hatred of Putin was very, very strong. And the fact is, they were not scared of the Ukrainian troops. They were not opposing Ukrainian troops. They didn't They were conversing with them very openly. So this probably gives me a good window into what might else be going inside of Russia. Just looking at these two different events, Rostov and Kursk, the people within Russia are not united behind Putin.
You've seen those interviews where people just ask people questions. Someone did that in Russia, and someone, I guess, spoke too openly and got 5.5 years, 5.5 years just for speaking that. Some young kid. That's crazy. But yeah, so since the economy, like Russia is definitely having a lot of problems with the war, but what seems like as the focus on spreading disinformation on the Western countries has increased. Maybe it's just me, or I don't know what are your thoughts on it. It's like last 6 months has been way more compared to, let's say, like the first 2 years of the war.
So Russia has made a very wise calculation many years ago, which is that realistically, it cannot wage war against NATO. And it has no illusions about that. It itself understands that's unrealistic. So why is it always trying to antagonize the West if it recognizes that? And the reason is very simple, is that Russia itself realizes as long as it keeps harassing the West and attacking the West using covert means, both through the information space as well as with, let's say, arson and assassinations, they can continue to influence what happens in the West. But it's never going to reach the boiling point. They're never going to do something like fire a missile at Brussels, which would trigger Article 5 in NATO. They'll always keep it just under that in order to do what they want and not be able to really get in serious trouble for it. So Russia knows that, one, it's very cheap to do information campaigns compared to conventional warfare. It's far, far cheaper. And you can influence the elections in other countries. You can influence tens of millions of people, and you don't have to fire a shot. And it's very hard to get caught. And if you are caught, what can be done against you? There's no real sanction for that. There's no way to punish them for this. So why would they not do it? And I expect, yes, it is very heavy now. I agree with you. It's increased a lot over the last half a year. But I think it's about to get even worse, especially as America's elections are approaching. And no matter who wins, the country is very divided. And that's something that Russia would love to take advantage of.
That makes sense. So yeah, before we get into the election, I wanted to get your thoughts on that too. I'm sure you saw the TikToker who went to Ukraine and he just posted like images of Kyiv, just showing that people are living a normal life, and he's saying that's where the taxpayer money is going. Then I talked to you, and you're actually been there, I think, since the war started, right? And you said yesterday that he was under attack from Russian and Iranian drones. Like, what do you have to say to people like that who actually? The sad part is he got millions of views because people actually believed him, and it was like young people on TikTok who were seeing his content.
You know, it's the total absurdity when you have to go to another country and hunt out locations of some nice cars, which, just look at the models. They were not new nice cars, but nice cars that are parked on a road. The fact that you find young people standing outside of a popular place where people get drinks, coffee, as well as wine, very cheap. It's, let's say, 50 cents a drink, 25 cents a drink. It's not an expensive place. And he says, but look at all these people here celebrating. Look what they're doing. I mean, they're 20 years old and they're spending 50 cents on a coffee. I don't think this is exactly going to change the war one way or the other, but also it's a free country. They have a right to do so. And how do we know that those people are not active duty military during the week? How do we know what they're doing in their volunteer time, or that they're students? So it was obviously done specifically to get views, and it's just rage farming. But it's pathetic. Frankly, it's pathetic because there's such incredible misery. I mean, there are thousands of people dying. There's been thousands of children kidnapped from Ukraine and sent to Russia. And the human suffering, the toll of it, is just overwhelming. And to imagine that somebody would come to Ukraine and take no interest in looking into that or covering that, but rather sort of mocking them, is beyond disgusting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the sad part is this is happening in the election year. And so I wanted to ask you, could Ukraine survive no matter who wins the US presidency?
Ukraine, one way or another, will survive, but whether or not it will be able to maintain its current lines of defense is a totally different question. And I think that's very questionable, and hence why Russia is investing heavily in trying to influence the US's elections. The United States plays a critical role, an absolutely critical role, in defending Ukraine. And it's something that the Ukrainian people are incredibly thankful for. But if the US were to stop assisting Ukraine, or even worse, let's imagine there's a person in the White House who refused to authorize our partners in Europe to even donate American made weapons. Ukraine would undoubtedly be in a situation that it would have to be fighting for its existence. We would no longer be able to have a conversation about how Ukraine could continue to maintain the lines. Rather, it would be how can we preserve the capital from falling? And that's something that's really in the hands of Americans if they choose to elect somebody who opposes Ukraine.
That's a good point. But Biden himself has been hesitant to give permission to Ukraine to strike inside Russia. Do you believe that's actually like because he's worried about escalation, or it's more of like he's got 3 months left in his presidency, he doesn't want take too much of a risk to like on his legacy, basically?
So I think Joe Biden, it's actually two different questions. I think one is he himself seriously believes there could be escalation. I think that is a major factor. Everything he said publicly makes that clear. And ultimately, the buck stops with him. It's his decision what happens next. But supporting that decision, and I think probably putting doubts into his mind, are people like Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, who has routinely said that we should be doing less for Ukraine. He's always been trying to curtail, whether it was talking about long range weapons for Ukraine, or the F 16s, or the TACMs. We have seen routinely that there has been resistance on the side of the White House to give Ukraine what it needs to win. And as America knows in its own history, when presidents have tied our hands behind our back when trying to wage warfare in a foreign country, it's very, very difficult. And ultimately, it leads to disaster. So if Joe Biden wants Ukraine to win, it's very simple in these final 3 months, is he could tell Ukraine, go for it. Do what the Europeans have already recommended to you. Fire within Russia and attack the military facilities there that are waging war against your country. More than that, imagine the number of Russian Air Force bases where we know there's airplanes there. We know that those airplanes are going to be having bombs put on them so that they can come attack Ukraine. And Ukraine cannot attack those facilities because the White House is against it. So it's not a partisan issue, it's just a fact. Only one person decides if Ukraine can attack the airports that'll be used to kill Ukrainian civilians. The White House decides this all. And unfortunately, the White House so far has been unwilling to budge.
Makes sense. I feel like Kremlin can feel the decision is coming closer and closer. That's why I'm sure you saw yesterday they did like this big show where they changed the nuclear doctrine. So does that actually change anything in terms of how Russia now responds using it nukes, or was it just like a show for the Western audience?
Putin will never use nukes, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the most simple reasons, though, are that one, he can't really be sure that his nuclear arsenal works correctly. They don't do the testing that they should be doing testing on. They are out of date. And imagine that. Imagine if Putin were to attempt to launch a nuclear attack. And imagine if the bomb just bounced around. Imagine that level of impotency. How could Putin at that point ever intimidate anybody if they realize his threats cannot be fulfilled? But second to that, it's been very clear that a lot of countries, including China importantly, have told Russia not to use nuclear weapons. And due to the relationship that China and Russia have, China is a lifeline for Russia. Putin simply can't take the risk. If China were to say, you've crossed the line and we're cutting off this friendship, because obviously China's economy is much more attached to Europe and the United States than it is to Russia, then Russia would be completely destroyed. And that would actually be even worse for Putin than anything else probably, is if China were to completely cut them off. So I don't think Putin would ever really consider taking that risk.
So I guess it was just like more of a show just to scare the Western audience. And
During the course of the war, Putin has said probably 30, 40 times that Russia has nuclear weapons or that they could use them. This nuclear saber rattling is just traditional Russian rhetoric, and it should not be taken seriously. And I don't know anyone who studies Russia who takes it seriously. Absolutely no one. Absolutely every single person who studies Russia as a profession will tell you Putin is just saying this because he knows there's going to be people sitting in the White House or in the National Security Council that will say, well, look, do we really want to cross that red line? Won't that be an escalation? But how if it starts World War III? There could be a nuclear Armageddon, all because of this decision. And he knows that it does have influence. There's people who are still scared of his empty threats. So it does serve a purpose, and Putin has been successful in that purpose, which is making sure that Ukraine cannot do what it needs to do to defend itself.
that makes sense. Also, we have a joke here at the channel. Is like when you look at just online comments, it does seem like there are a lot more people scared. And all the people who are scared about Putin, they always start their comments saying, I'm a US citizen. No normal person start.
It's funny. I'm not surprised. Russian, when you look at it, the reality is that Russia is a country that has no capacity to wage warfare against a major country. Ukraine was substantially smaller before the war, as it is now, than Russia. And so it's a very different story. I mean, it was coming from the Soviet experience and everything else, but a country that's equipped with modern weapons fully, a European country, NATO, or the US, Russia is scared of them. It shouldn't be the other way around. Russia knows very well if the US were to decide it wants to come to town, it could really turn things upside down very quickly for the Kremlin.
And I guess that's exactly the point of the disinformation campaign, because they can avoid that just by spreading false information here. Another part is, since you know how Ukraine has been fighting for more help from its allies, do you think the war would end if US can double down on stopping Iran, China, North Korea from helping Russia?
Absolutely. And we look at what's happened recently, and this is sort of important, is that the axis of countries that are helping Russia the most, their allies, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, are countries that are already having their own domestic problems. In the case of Venezuela, the elections recently were very unpopular. You saw the rioting. Venezuela can't do much really to help. But then you look at North Korea, major flooding last month. North Korea's also had its own domestic problems. But Iran itself had a very interesting announcement yesterday, saying that they were not going to continue military cooperation with Russia. Now, I doubt if that's really going to come to fruition or if that was just said for the public, but there could be a logic to it. Remember that Iran also requested Russia's help last month to receive air defense, knowing that there was going to be the high potential for a future war with Israel. Requesting that air defense, thinking that Russia is its partner, as Iran has sent incredible numbers of drones to Russia to attack Ukraine, the Iranians were very disappointed to hear the Russians say, we can't really help you right now. And the reason is simple. The Ukrainians had invaded Kursk, and knowing this and recognizing that now the operations were spreading, Russia needed those air defense systems in southern Russia, and they couldn't afford to send them to Iran. More than that, Iran itself is looking out for its own self-interest. There's domestic problems. The government's unpopular. It's got huge economic problems. Getting more involved with Russia doesn't really help. Smarter move is to protect their own interest first. And all of foreign politics, always, all of foreign policy comes down to domestic politics first. Leaders will always do what's in their country's interest first. Not what's right, not what's better, not what's more strategic, but ultimately, is this going to be good for my country? Doesn't really matter if it's good for your country or not, but first and foremost, is it good for my country? And so I think that the Iranian leadership is going to try to defend its own interest first, as do other dictatorships with whom the Putin regime cooperates.
Yeah. Did you see that news that Russia might be sending missiles to Houthi? Is that just like the goal is to cause more chaos so the support thins out in Ukraine? Or
So I think it's very possible that Russia is trying to help the Houthis and others. We know that Russia has a history of working with groups that are banned internationally. And there's a logic to that, by the way, as well. But I would not be surprised. They do want to create chaos. They do want to take the attention off of the war in Ukraine. They want the Europeans to go worry about other things. And Russia, though, the relationship with the terrorists, I'd love to talk about just for a second, because I think it's so key and people don't understand it, is that Russia, like Iran, like North Korea, etc., is sanctioned. So it can't operate normally like other countries can, where it can send money via banks or even save money in foreign banks or reserves in foreign banks. It doesn't have that option. So instead, it has to go to the black market. Hence why there's so much bartering and trade within these pariah states. But more than that, it operates also with terrorist organizations. Remember, after October 7th attacks in Israel, the Hamas leadership went to Moscow just a couple days later and very openly met with the most senior levels of the Russian government. But outside of that, we look at their cooperation with terrorist organizations in Latin America, including things that were the communist radical revolutionary groups and other things like this. But today, where it's even more important, is with the drug cartels. Iran cooperates directly with drug cartels. Venezuela does as well. And Russia plays a key role in helping to orchestrate the international drug trade. And this is actually fascinating. And the answer of why they would do this is pretty simple. Russia does not have access to a lot of things that it needs, but it can provide services to these groups so that they're more successful. But these groups also provide a second benefit, which is that a terrorist group or a drug cartel creates confusion, creates chaos, and also distracts the population from what Russia is really interested in doing, in this case, Ukraine. So Russia's ongoing cooperation with rogue states and rogue actors is something that wish Americans would understand, including things like illegal immigration in the United States, is something that Russia tries to pump up because it knows that will be positive for the political parties or political party that it supports in the United States.
Like you just said earlier, that every foreign policy is basically a reflection of domestic policy. And I know you have a video coming up where you talk about Russia's internal regime and how Putin's structure is set up. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that. And I highly recommend everyone who's watching this go subscribe to that channel. We'll have it first link in the description, and or you can just do it in the top right corner, the card above.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So the Putin regime itself, the fundamental thing, and it's something that Gary Kasparov actually has talked about for well over a decade at this point, is the fact is I think the West gets it wrong. We think of Russia as being just a country like every other country, but it's not just like Canada. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The rule of law for Russia is what it abuses in order to be able to create a state of chaos globally, which allows it to do what it wishes to do. For instance, the diplomats that it has in other embassies don't only engage in espionage, but they also engage in crimes in foreign countries, like arson. They also engage in things in helping coordinate with the intelligence service of Russia with local criminal actors. They flout international law by saying, but we have diplomats. They have a legal right to be there. They have the right to not be arrested. But Russia's just abusing international law to be able to continue doing what it's doing. And what's the reason for that? It is a criminal organization. So whenever we look at Russia and we say, but it's a country, but it has these rights or has these responsibilities, Russia's totally uninterested. The senior leadership, Putin, his allies, the Siloviki, and the oligarchy are only interested in what is best for them. What's good for Russia, what's good for the Russian people is certainly not something they think about. And this communistic view of humanity, to quote David Satter, I think is exactly what differentiates the Russian mentality and the Russian government's mentality from Western governments, is that we Americans, for instance, when our soldiers get killed overseas, it is really a tragedy and we worry about it. For Russians to send in tens of thousands of men who will just die, just be sent off to the slaughter, it doesn't really matter because the government isn't really interested in capturing, let's say, Solidar, Ukraine, which they captured last year, because it's good for the Russian military, it's good for Russia's strategic plans in Ukraine. No, they wish to capture the village of Solidar, Ukraine, because it has a huge salt mine, something that Prigozhin had been promised if he was able to take it. Losing tens of thousands of men to take a salt mine, which he would take for his own economic benefit. Same with Eastern Ukraine, the parts of the country that are under occupation that have huge amounts of shale or coke and other things. That's what it really comes down to. Russia is interested in its leadership enriching itself more and more and preserving their power. What actually happens to the people of Russia? Absolutely nobody cares about. And we've seen that Russia, and Putin specifically, has no qualms whatsoever about killing his own citizens in large numbers, even if that means it would help him to obtain or to maintain power.
Perfect. Since we did bring up the soldiers, I saw some stats recently, which it was some anonymous Russian official, or not sure who it was, where Russia considers it a success if they can kill one Ukrainian soldier for 12 of Russian soldiers. That means they just need more soldiers. So is Putin going to do another mobilization? Is he worried about it, how the population will react? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that Putin will not do mobilization because he's scared of his own population. Putin, like all dictators, as I said, I mean, he's a criminal don. He's a don of the mafia. He's really not interested in whether or not Russia can win the war, I think, as much as he's interested in making sure that he survives the war. So the last thing that Putin's ever going to do is something that could actually end up posing a risk to his own ability to stay in the Kremlin. So I think that Putin, no matter what would happen, would avoid taking something high risk, like starting a mobilization, which could actually turn the population against you, or could cause people within the intelligence service, within the military, or from the oligarchy to start to talk to each other and say, you know, this is getting a little too out of control. We see the population's already fully against him. Now might be the moment that we strike and we get rid of Putin, and we can really quickly get the population on board with us after the coup if we tell the population there's not going to be any mobilization. So I think that Putin recognizes that he's swimming with sharks and he wouldn't take such a risk.
That makes sense. I guess that's full circle. We started off talking about oligarchy and we ended off. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope we do this again.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.